Are we good? Welcome. Today we're going to talk about some search engine optimization, aka SEO. I have a lot of stuff to talk about. Usually I like when it's interactive and, questions and answers, but for time's sake, I'm asking that maybe you can take questions at the end, if you wouldn't mind, so that I can talk about all the stuff I was going to talk about. If I can get the slides to change. Oh, come on. There we go. My name is Linnea Hubble. You gotta have one of these slides if you're not already famous. So I do SEO, and I got into this. I'm not a developer. I got into SEO like 12, 13 years ago, and just really specialized in that. I think it's a fascinating field of work, and it's ever changing, and there's always new stuff to learn. I have been working in-house in pretty large organizations for most of my career, so my talk will be influenced by that a bit. But recently I started my own consultancy, so that's what I do now. I really like the working in-house because you can really get into things at depth, and it's also nice to work together with developers and really try to solve problems together. I think that's how you make the most SEO success, when you work that way. So for this talk, I was thinking, I can't teach you everything about SEO in 45 minutes, but we can do some myth busting and talk about common misconceptions and ideas that are floating around, that maybe was true at some point in time and it's not so true anymore, or it's just a misunderstanding. So myth number one is, if you pay for Google Ads, you get higher rankings. And talking about that, we'll get into a little bit what is paid search, what's organic search, and a little bit of an intro to search engine optimization. So if you do think that part is a little boring because you already know, then we will get to other stuff after that. Myth number two is build it and they'll come. Basically, that SEO will kind of take care of itself. So in that case, we will also talk a little bit about the competitive landscape in search and how that affects things. Myth number three, Google says. That's where a lot of the kind of misunderstandings come from. Google says something and then people interpret that in another way. So it's a little bit about how to find the right information and what to think about when you hear something. Myth number four, we don't want Google to index that, so we'll just block it in robots.txt. I've heard that many times, so we're going to talk about indexing and crawling. Myth number five is, with dub or without, it doesn't really matter, it's the same page. That part is about duplication issues and canonicalization. And then the last one is about JavaScript and SEO. And on all those topics, there's a ton of stuff to say, so it will be pretty brief, but a little bit for everyone, I hope. So let's just dive right in. Yes, it worked. So, myth number one, if you pay for Google Ads, you get higher rankings. Since I'm already saying it's a myth, it's obviously not really true. But let's just look at typical search results. So they all look different. This is a search for a product, so then you get some Google shopping ads on top, which is not the same thing as the regular Google ads that are coming underneath. and then you have the organic search results. So that you get higher rankings if you pay for Google Ads is a common idea, but they don't really have very much to do with each other. I mean, even if you look at Google as an organization, the people who are getting site owners to pay for advertising don't really have a whole lot to do with the people that are working on search quality. Yeah, they're pretty solid walls in between the teams. And then, of course, there is if you have a big company with a big ad spend, then they are not unlikely to rank high in organic search as well. But as we all know, correlation doesn't mean causation, and there are other reasons for that. So I have colleagues that are specialized in paid search, and even though we kind of show up in the same space, we have very different jobs. So they work a lot with numbers, and what is the budget, what's the spend, how much ROI can they get, whereas I work more, well, we're going to get to that, but you have to earn your place in organic search. Of course, that is a little bit easier if you're very rich, but still. So that's a myth. Also, for this whole talk, I'm going to talk a lot about Google, and I'm going to talk about search engines, and I'm going to use them pretty synonymously. I mean, does search engine mean Google? No, obviously not. But kind of, yeah. Because they are the largest globally in Sweden, in the Nordics, in Europe, and in the world. So just, they're very dominant, obviously. There are other search engines, of course, like Bing has a higher market share in the US than they have elsewhere. If you go to Russia, you have Yandex, and China, of course, is a very different situation, since they're not really friends with Google. Well, to and from. But there you have Baidu. So there are other search engines, but I will talk about Google and I'll talk about search engine, and I pretty much mean the same thing. So what do you do then to be visible in organic search? Well, it helps to start thinking about what does the search engine do? They basically do three things. They crawl your content, index your content, and then they rank your content. So crawling is a good starting point, because if your pages aren't crawled, it is extremely unlikely that they would be indexed and ranked. Not completely impossible, which I will get to later, but pretty much impossible. So when you have content you want to be indexed, obviously you shouldn't block it from being crawled. You can block content in a robots.txt file, but also if you have to log in to see something, Google's not going to log in. If your email marketing team is very happy to say, oh, let's only let people only access this content if they first give us their email address, because they want more email addresses. Google's not going to put in an email address either, so then they're not going to see that content. Links, of course, is also a must if you want it to be crawled. And that's a good thing to think about if you are thinking of making links in JavaScript, or changing a menu, or thinking mobile versus desktop, how you're linking. Linking is the way, internal linking is how Google will crawl your site. Then there's the concept of a crawl budget. And that means Google doesn't crawl. Well, if you have 20 pages, Google will probably crawl all your pages in one go. But if you have a large website, they're not going to stay there forever and crawl every page. They're going to crawl some of it, and then they're going to come back another time and crawl some more. So a crawl budget is defined as the number of URLs that Googlebot can and will or wants to crawl. And that's depending on the crawl rate, which is basically how well the site performs and responds when they're trying to get content, and also demand. If it's something that has a high demand, they will crawl more often. Like a news site, for example, they crawl all the time. But if there's not very much demand from indexing, or if your site doesn't respond very well, then the crawl budget will be diminished. Oops. And it's not like there's a number either. You can't like know your crawl budget. It's different every time they show up. You just know that there is such a thing, and it's good to optimize so that you make sure they crawl the content, the pages that you want them to be crawling. So then we get to the index part. Even if they crawl your content, it's not for sure that they will index it. But Google wants to crawl and index as much stuff as they can. But for example, if you have a lot of duplicate content, they don't want to index maybe all of that. Also, if you have no index tags, that means they can crawl it, but they're not going to index it. And you can check if you have a page indexed or not by doing a simple site search in Google like this. So if they have it, it will show up. And if they don't have it, you just do site : and then your domain or your page. You can even add a keyword after the domain and see what they have indexed for that query. And then the last part is ranking. And ranking is, really the secret sauce for Google. They are very transparent in what you should think about for crawling and indexing, because they really want to be able to crawl and index all your stuff. But they don't really want you to know too much about how to rank. So there's hundreds of factors that determine ranking. It could be anything from how old is the domain to how many links do you have from high authority websites, and hundreds of other things. It also depends a lot on if it's a competitive search term. Who else is trying to rank for what you're trying to rank for? And then position 1 to 10 is really all that matters, because not very many people go to the next page or the next one after that or the next one after that. I do occasionally, but not everyone is like that. So what is SEO then? Well, obviously, as an SEO, what you want to do is make sure that Google can crawl, index, and rank your content. And just very briefly, I would divide the work that I do in 3 parts. It's content, which means, when I say content, I mean both the pages that you have and how well they match a search query, and then also the content on that page, like the text and the images and the video or whatever it is. That's what I mean by content. And then links is the next one. Links from external sites pointing to your site is, of course, really important. That's why Google became Google, because they came up with the idea that if you can look at what other people are saying about your site, it's a better measure of your content and quality than if you only ask what you think about your site. And then the last part is technical SEO, which we are going to be diving a little more into today, because I don't think you're the right audience to talk about links and how to write compelling content. I think we have other stuff to talk about. Some people might also say that, oh, but UX is like should be a fourth bullet point on this list. And I think UX aspects come into both when you're dealing with content, also when internal linking and menus and a bunch of technical issues too that has to do with, okay, what's a good user experience? So I don't really count that as a separate thing. I think it's part of the other three. So that was kind of the introduction, and now we can get into myth number 2, which is build it and they'll come. I often hear people say that, oh, you shouldn't be doing too much like conscious SEO. Like all you need to do is you build a good site, and then it's gonna work itself out. And so I'm gonna tell you a little anecdote. My mother called me one day, and she said, Linnea, I'm angry at Google. And my first reaction was, oh, my mom knows what my job is. Because, she's over 70. But it turns out she and a group of other volunteers are running a library that used to be like a public library, but then the municipality decided to close it down. So she and other locals decided, like, no, we're going to keep this library open, and they were applying for grants to buy books, and, they work for free to keep it open. Really, as a community service. But when you typed in the name of the library in Google, what showed up was the municipality website saying that this library is permanently closed. So they're like, no, it's not. So, of course, I could help with this. And I just helped them build a website. And we put some content on there in the opening hours. And, now if you look at Google Maps, like it shows up there and it's all good. But in this case, we started ranking number 1 immediately. And that's not because I'm a super genius SEO. It's because no one else was trying. Not even the municipality website was, maliciously trying to say that the library was closed. They were probably just the only ones on the web that was saying anything about it at all. So that's what Google's going to find. And now they have a much better website for that query. So in this case, it really is, build it and they'll come. You just made a website, it worked out. But I'm going to guess that most of you who are interested in SEO, since you're in this room, you want to rank for something maybe a little more difficult that other people are also trying to rank for. And that's a whole different story, because then everyone is trying to rank for whatever you're trying to rank for. And that means, as I mentioned, you have position 1 to 10. Your page has to be the best. One of the 10 best out of hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of other options. But the majority of the web, it consists of small websites. And that's also something, when Google gives advice, they're usually talking to the small website owner who doesn't have to worry about crawl budgets and these kind of things, because it doesn't apply to them. But maybe for your site, that's important. So that kind of brings me to my next myth, which is, but Google said. So I don't know if you recognize that picture, but have Has anyone here read Robert Jordan's fantasy books? They're called The Wheel of Time. And in those, well, at least someone, in those books, there are people with magical abilities, basically witches and sorcerers. And they are supposed to help humankind and to make people trust them because, scary magical stuff. They have taken an oath that makes it impossible for them to tell a lie. So, because they can't lie, but they don't really want to say everything all the time, they become very skilled at saying something that you think means something, but that's not actually what they said. Um, and that kind of reminds me of sometimes of Google. Not that they are trying to do anything bad. I'm not saying they're trying to mislead people, but they are a great source of information, as I mentioned earlier, especially about how they crawl and how they index content. And then people take that and makes a whole lot of assumptions based on that. And that's why it gets confusing. And yeah, that's just something that you need to think about. That Google they don't do SEO. That's not their thing. They are building a search engine, and everything they say is based on that. So let's see. So just think for a moment about what do they want? What is their goal? They want to have a good user experience for people using their search engine, and they want to make lots of money on ads. And then they're trying to balance these two. They also want to crawl and index as much as they can because that's their bread and butter. But then when it comes to ranking, which is what SEO is all about, it doesn't really matter for Google if it's your site that ranks or someone else, as long as it's relevant to what the user was searching for. So a lot of people put a little too high, like, oh, well, Google will take care of this, or Google can figure it out, or, what I'm doing with my site, and they can handle it. And I'm just saying, like, don't count on that. They have no interest in your particular site. They have an interest in making a good search result. So if you want your site to rank, that's really up to you. And as a final note, Google is also very into big brands, and that's because so they get a little more leeway when it comes to it's a little easier if you're a big brand because people are searching for you and they want to see you in the search results even if your technical SEO isn't perfect. So it's a little harder the smaller you are. So just think about this, that Google often explains how their search engine works, but not from an SEO perspective. They're not talking about what you should do to rank high. That's never what they talk about. They also don't want to share too much information about how the ranking process works because people manipulate it all the time or try to find loopholes, and that's not a good thing for Google. So it's kind of like what we need to say, we say. I mean, for example, it's a good thing when they come out and say, oh, if you have a mobile friendly site, that's good. Oh, shit. That's good for ranking. Because then people make better mobile sites. I mean, everyone wins in that scenario. But I just want to encourage you to read a little bit behind the lines and see what are they not saying, or do they use words as we might or we could, because that's not the same thing as being completely certain of something. And then compare to other sources, read about someone who's been testing something, or test yourself for that matter. But just like I said, I think they're a great source of information. I read the Webmaster blog. I watched all the YouTube videos. I mean, just know what it is you're looking at. It's not like the whole complete truth. So then our next myth is we don't want Google to index that, so let's block it in robots.txt. I have heard this so many times. It is, I think, yeah, the way most people think that's how you should treat something that you don't want to be indexed. But then we have to remember, crawling does not equal indexing, and indexing does not equal crawling. They are two separate processes. So content can be crawled without being indexed. We already talked about that. If for some reason they don't really like it or you said not to. But you might not know that it is possible for content to be indexed without being crawled as well. So I was wondering, maybe you've seen this in a search result sometime, where it says a description for this result is not available because of this site's robots.txt. So what does that mean? That means this site's robots.txt says disallow this URL from being crawled, but they are not. I'm going to make sure I don't drop my whole computer here. Phone seemed to survive, but I don't think the computer would. So there are probably other links pointing to this page, and they are not disallowed. It could be probably links from your own website or externally. So what they do then is they take the information they can from the links pointing to this page and present it in the search result anyways, meaning they index it, but they're not allowed to crawl it, so they can't read, for example, the meta description, which would come up as a snippet, and they can't read the text, so they can't use that to generate a snippet either. So they just leave it like that. So this is done without crawling them. So if you don't want something indexed, then what should you do? Well, I already mentioned the no index tag. They really obey that one. So it is very important to not accidentally set a no index tag, which I've also seen. It could be, they no index the entire domain and everyone's freaking out, or the home page or something. It got in there somehow. So don't make mistakes with that one. But also good to know that for the no index tag to be effective, the page must not be blocked by robots.txt. Because if you block it, the crawler is never gonna see the no index tag because they're not gonna crawl the page. So it doesn't work to use robots.txt to remove pages from the index. If they're already indexed and you then block them from crawling, they're just going to stay in the index. So if something has already been crawled and indexed and you want it removed, you put a no index tag on it and do not block it in robots.txt. Because a lot of people would do both. Because it's like, oh, well, to be extra safe, we do both. But that doesn't work. So then you might wonder, well, what do you use a robots.txt file for? Well, it is about managing your crawl budget, which historically was more important when it was maybe difficult for a site to handle the crawler. But you can still use it to keep Google away from sections that you don't want crawled, period. For example, search results. They don't really like to have indexed your search results in their search results anyway. So that could be a good thing to block. Some people, some have like test pages or they're working on something that's not ready to be published yet, but can still be accessed. I've seen examples like where you put that in a test folder and then disallow that from being crawled. And those are highly unlikely to be linked to from somewhere else. So in that case, it works. I mean, it is extremely unlikely that those kind of URLs would be indexed. So go ahead and, just stop Google from crawling them because it's just a waste of time. And that brings us to our next myth. How am I doing on time? All right. Myth number 5 is with www or without www, doesn't really matter, is the same page. And I could substitute those for HTTP and HTTPS or trailing slash and not. I'll explain. So this is about 2 other concepts, which is duplication and canonicalization. So what is duplicate content? Duplicate content is basically when you can find the same content or more or less the same content, because it's not like a black and white, it's kind of a gray too, a scale, on more than one URL. And Google really, really doesn't like duplicate content. And they're trying a lot of things to stop that from showing up in their search engine. And that has historical reasons. There are a lot of reasons for why you would have duplicate content on your site. The first one I can think of is that one site is just scraping another site's content and then passing it off as their own. And that's a way to just get Google traffic, and Google really doesn't like that. Or maybe auto-generating landing pages with very thin content where you're basically just changing a word or so, and then you have, 1,000 pages with a pretty poor user experience. Google's not very fond of that either. It could be more non-spammy things, like if you have a product that comes in a lot of different versions, for example, I don't know, something that comes in 20 different colors, and then you have the product page, you have one for each color, so then you have 20 pages about the same product, and the only difference is one is blue and one is green. Or copy pasting content from someone else, even if you're allowed to do that and they're saying, here you go, take my stuff, and it's fine. That's still duplicate content. Buying content, very common. For example, again, product descriptions that are the same everywhere. That's duplicate content. Or maybe a company has like many websites with pretty much the same stuff on them. And then you can have different versions of a URL, like I was mentioning in the beginning. That's just some example. I mean, there are a gazillion ways to get duplicate content. But it's not a good thing. So then what is canonicalization? Lovely word, so easy to say. It's the process of picking the best URL when there are several versions to choose from. And even though you might think in these examples that, it's the same page, I have to say, especially with HTTP or HTTPS, it really feels like, well, how are you going to serve different content? Anyways, it's technically possible. So for Google, these are different pages. I've had a lot of people tell me, oh, but that's stupid. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It doesn't matter. It's the case. So these are just some examples. Any little different, even if it's just a slash at the end of the URL, makes a difference. So if you have different versions of your URL, but with the same content, ta-da, you have duplicate content. And that's not a good thing. So why is this a problem then? Well, first of all, it could be a waste of your crawl budget that I was talking about. Imagine you have a large website and you can access it both on HTTP and on HTTPS. And then Google goes nuts and crawls both of them. I mean, that's twice as many pages as they should be crawling. They also get confused. What page should they rank? So then they will just pick a version. And it might not be the one that you wanted them to pick. Duplicate content, as I said, they really don't like it. It's, first of all, it's not good for your rankings. But then it also, I mean, you can, if they think you have too much, you can be penalized for it. Another thing is you want those external links that are going to a page to collect SEO value into one URL. So say you have 4 different versions of that URL and each one is accessible. So some people might link to that one and some people might link to that one. Then you have diluted this value when you could have consolidated it into one URL that then has a better chance of ranking higher. So you solve this either with redirects or with a canonical tag. And redirects, 301 redirects, are really good for handling these canonicalization issues. So you just redirect HTTP to HTTPS and without the W to with the W if that's how you want it. And if you have, it ends with something like that or index.html or something, you redirect them to the cleaner version. 301 redirects are also really good when you're changing a page's URL, like maybe you're updating an article or you're changing the name of a category or a product, and then you want to redirect the old URL to the new URL. Also, if people have been linking to a page on your website and you now have that content on another page, if you do the 301 redirect, you will then move the SEO value to the new URL. There are occasions when a 301 redirect is not so good, and that's mainly when people get a little too lazy and they rely on them for fixing all their problems rather than going and cleaning up old links and making sure that links on the website are always updated to point directly to the target URL. And also make sure you don't get redirect chains. So if you change a page, say you have a category page and you change the name to something and you make a redirect and then you change it again a year later and then you make a new redirect, you should try to redirect from both these pages to the new one, so you don't have to go through more than one. Also, when you do HTTPS or www, it's nice to get both of those in one redirect as well. It seems it's often default behavior to have 302 redirects. And there is some discussion in the SEO world if they do indeed transfer SEO value or not. But until people are absolutely sure, I will recommend 301 redirects. I guess unless you really are moving something temporarily, which is usually not the case. So then when do you use a canonical tag? That's when you actually want people to be able to access slightly different content. For example, if you have sorting and filtering options and you want people to be able to access that, you can choose the canonical URL. You can't redirect it because then you can't get to that page that was redirected. But then you can use the canonical tag instead. Last myth, which is 2020 now. Search engines can handle JavaScript just fine. This is something that Google has been saying publicly that they can do since 2014. And their ambition is to handle JavaScript content as well as HTML. But they are not really there yet. And I will explain why that is. So Googlebot processes JavaScript web apps in 3 phases. So they put a URL in a crawl queue, then they get the crawler, they can immediately process the HTML and index that part of the page. But if they say, okay, there's client-side rendering JavaScript here that we should come back and look at this with our web rendering service. So then that's put in a different queue and then processed separately. So those are 2 separate processes. And I think when Google says, oh, that we can crawl index JavaScript just fine, you don't really think of this extra step to do that. That's not what it sounds like. Also, it's worth remembering that other search engines, Google is the best at this right now. So other search engines, depending on how important you think they are, is not as good. But there are a lot of limitations in this. For example, Google themselves, again, if you read a little bit more carefully, you can see they say things like the rendering stage is run at best effort, or we cannot make any guarantees, or they say Google can run most JavaScript. And to me, that just says, oh, so not all. But also when they come back in the second wave, there's a time limit for how long they will wait. So they spend a few seconds, and it's pretty difficult to know, okay, how much time do you have to render the whole page? The other thing is, when does the second process happen? And it can take, I've heard, as long as up to 10 days later. And if you have a new cool product, 10 days is a really long time when you want something to come out. And especially, of course, on large websites or websites that update their content or change their content a lot, this is more of an issue. Then it's also the question of what content on the page do Googlebot think is necessary to be put in this separate queue and to be rendered. Because they don't do that with all JavaScript. They do it if they think it's important. So for example, if you have a list of products and then you have maybe to load more products requires them to render JavaScript, maybe they won't do that because they already felt like they got a whole page of content, and then it will be more difficult for your other product pages to be crawled and indexed. Also, if you have any errors, anything at all in the JavaScript code, then Google will stop rendering the page. And then, of course, we are as usual with Google, just talking about the ability to crawl and index. We're not talking about ranking. So if you, just because they are able to crawl and index doesn't mean you're going to rank well. So in that case, you have to look at what are my competitors doing? Are they giving Google easier to process content and therefore will rank higher? Or is their content now, more updated, whereas mine has to wait for a week until it gets indexed? Those affect rankings. So what do we do about this? Do we just forget about JavaScript? Let's just go back in time and just do HTML forever and ever? Of course not. We can't do that. But everything I've been talking about applies to client-side rendering JavaScript. So you could use server-side rendering, presenting the search engine with content from the start. And then, there are different ways of doing this. You can use a pre-rendering service, or you can server-side render certain aspects, certain critical elements. You can use dynamic rendering. What solution works best, I think, is very much dependent on other circumstances as well. So that's, I'm just saying, take SEO into consideration when making these decisions and work together to figure out the best solution for you. You can either give both users and the search engine an initial HTML view and then add the JavaScript functionality on top, or you can even say, okay, this is Googlebot. We give them an HTML snapshot of the page, and normal users get the client-side rendering. But there is solutions. So finally, I just want to leave you with this. This title is in Swedish. Maybe everyone speaks Swedish in here. I have no idea. But it basically means many little creeks turn into a big river. And it just happens to rhyme in Swedish. But some of these things that I've been talking about have a very large impact, like all the JavaScript stuff, for example, on your search performance. But most of the time, it's little tweaks and little things and just working continuously on those that will give you good SEO performance. So just keep tweaking and keep improving little by little. Thank you very much for listening.